Happy Wednesday. Welcome back to the Lorden Arts channel. I'm John Lorden. Thank you so much for spending some time with me here today. I bumped into an article about crime stats, and I do look into crime statistics pretty regularly because of my work here on the channel. Is this article accurate? Does it line up with some of the things that I've noticed? Let's take a look at that together. This one's a little bit dated. It's from the middle of 2021. This is from July 2021 over at CNN. As COVID-19 rates improved and vaccinations allowed much of the country to reopen, reports of crime waves began to dominate headlines. I'm sure you guys saw some of that. Understanding crime trends requires nuance, but gaps and inconsistencies in the data make it easy to misinterpret and spin facts in a way that serves political agendas instead of evidence-based solutions. One really important thing to keep in mind with this, I think this article touches on it at some point, crime statistics are typically coming in a little slowly. So when I'm covering a case for you guys, and if there's a particular crime stat that I want to look at, I'm lucky if I could find some reasonable statistics for maybe 2 years ago, and sometimes I have to reach back all the way to 5 years. And one of the things this article talks about is, first of all, one of the best sources for that is the crime reporting that happens to the FBI. But even that being one of the best sources, basically most of the police departments are reporting to the FBI almost on a volunteer level or capacity. So it's not giving you a very strong sample set. It's not like, every police department is reported to or is mandated to report on these things. That's not quite how it works. Even if they were, I can tell you just the way that I've seen the statistics churn out from the FBI, you're not going to get stats for anything. At this point, I think maybe you could start seeing some stats for 2020. But 2019, I think, is the bigger sample set that's available right now. Of course, when we're talking about the pandemic and how this could be impacting downtown areas, if we're looking at a sample set from 2019, not super helpful. They do release, they're trying to look at trending and stuff like that in the middle of the years where this stuff is occurring, but that's a lot different than compiled information that has been, all crunched together. But this article is kind of hitting on a different note, just the fact that, the title of this article is How Crime Stats Lie. So what's their point here with this? What we know, only specific crimes have increased. It's important to be clear about what types of crime are on the rise. Several forms of property crime, including robberies, residential burglaries, and larceny, declined in 2020 and continue to go down in the first quarter of 2021, according to a report from the National Commission on COVID-19 and Criminal Justice, continuing a multi-year downward trend. Some of that, I think, makes pretty logical sense, especially residential burglaries. If all of a sudden everyone's working from home, you're spending a lot more time at home. Your kids might not be going to school. You might be teaching them from home. The life that we were all living in 2020, not to mention different lockdown mandates that were happening, people not supposed to be out after certain curfew hours and things like that. Just the opportunity for a criminal to move to a particular place to commit a particular crime was starting to get tricky, starting to get dicey. So how would that happen, or how would that impact residential burglaries? Of course, I think it would almost just about completely remove them. You would have people, if you were going to try to pull off something like that, you would have to be relatively certain. I think most criminals would be trying to hit those homes when there's no one there. So it would take a lot more footwork in terms of watching a house for a prolonged period of time, trying to figure out someone's pattern and all this stuff. I just don't think it's going to happen from that mindset. And of course, these stats seem to be supporting that type of information. According to the FBI's preliminary 2020 findings, violent crime rose by 3% across the country last year, which I think a lot of people were concerned about when COVID first started coming into play. Particularly, we were concerned about domestic violence related issues with couples that were maybe used to not being together 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, now being put in that situation. But the number of murders rose by 25% between 2019 and 2020. That's the largest jump recorded in the US in a one-year period since the FBI began releasing annual figures in the 1960s. Now, that in itself sounds horrible. You don't want to see a statistical jump like that. The worst since you guys have started tracking numbers. Yes, but does that mean that that was the most murders that year? No. And I think that's a really good tone this article is trying to hit. Like, you can make a statement like that and everyone's going to say, oh my God, we've had the most murders in the US in that year. And that's not what it's saying. It's saying that it was the largest jump. So basically, murders have been trailing off since the 80s and 90s, got to a relatively low point. We hit COVID, and there's an increase, a 25% increase, but still not as bad as the numbers that we were seeing in the 80s and 90s. The NCCCJ's findings were similar, citing a 30% increase in the homicide rate between 2019 and 2020 in the 34 major cities that it surveyed. Experts say that classifying an increase in homicides as part of a crime wave obscures the fact that murder is a unique, devastating crime, one that requires targeted solutions. Very interesting statement, and it kind of makes sense. Like, if you had an unlimited budget and you said, okay, we were going to take on murder, how would you go about trying to do that? Are you going to hire a bunch more cops, have them walking the streets? Is that really where these are occurring? Probably not. I mean, some of them certainly. But would that really help mitigate that risk if there was more police officers that were out and about? It's a big question. And I don't have the answer. But it's pointing out that this isn't just a matter of, hey, let's go ahead and throw more cops at it, and that means that the place is going to be safer. If we're talking about murder in particular, you'd have to take those stats and break them down, stranger on stranger murder, domestic violence related murder, and then kind of break those categories out, understand those categories, and say, okay, now how do we attack these individual things? Back to a quote, "It wasn't a surge in crime, it was a surge in murder. Murder is very specific, and if we're going to have solutions, we need to be specific about what the problem is," said Jeff Asher, a crime analyst in New Orleans. He's been tracking the number of homicides year to date across more than 70 major cities, and about 2/3 have had more homicides this year than the last. Now, I had mentioned below that we've had the biggest amount of growth from one year to the next in the U.S. in terms of murder, but the murder rate in 2020 was about 6.2 per 100,000 people. That's about 40% below what it was in the 1980s and the 1990s. So that's what we mean about the total number in the 80s and 90s any murder is problematic. It used to be a much larger issue. And now we've seen a jump, but even despite that jump, we're still 40% below where we were in terms of some of the worst numbers that we saw on that. That said, this downward trend is not consistent across the board. Last year, major cities like Philadelphia and St. Louis experienced their worst homicide numbers in decades, and Columbus saw the highest number of homicides ever recorded in the city when the murder rate jumped to 19 per 100,000 residents. So we've certainly got outliers, and we do have Columbus seeing their worst numbers ever. But experts urge caution when using a one-year increase. A one-year homicide rate, even if it's increased, should not be used to suggest that we're in the midst of a long-term uptick in homicide. That's another thing I've gotten just from looking at stats, particularly the FBI's information year over year. If you look at multiple sample sets, you're going to see fluctuations. One year it's going to be a little higher, the next year it's going to be a little lower. And of course, that's where we kind of get to our averages of what those numbers are. And from one year to the next, you're not always going to hit that average. You're going to be above it in some cases and below it in others. So is this an ongoing problem? What's going on? Keeping in mind, this is an article from the middle of 2021. During this year's July 4th holiday weekend, which is typically a violent time for cities across America, we've talked about that on the channel before, there were 233 fatal shootings, which is actually down 26% from the year before. that's interesting because if we would have been talking about July of 2020, I would expect that to have been severely impacted because we had so many people that were not going to get together. We know that a lot of these July 4th homicides could be alcohol fueled, large gatherings, those types of situations or factors that contribute to those homicides. And in 2020, I think we would have had less of those factors at play than in 2021. In Chicago, shootings year to date are flat between 2020 and 2021. That's really interesting to me. In St. Louis, homicides year to date are down by 9%. I've seen a quote that is usually tossed around in meme fashion. It says it's by Mark Twain, but if you look into it, the actual source is a little questionable in itself. But the quote is, "There are lies, damned lies, and statistics." Do I think that statistics are helpful for understanding trends? Yes, absolutely. Do I think that all statistics are lies? No. Do I think that statistics can be misused? Absolutely. I saw it in my professional career before I was doing this line of work a lot. So it is something that I think we need to be careful of. And in particular, with these articles that we're seeing about certain types of crimes being on the rise, maybe it's worth just doing another little extra search or clicking that extra little link to see what the source information is for, taking a look at it for yourself, listening to other people's analysis of the same information. You'd be surprised. You can hear two fairly different points of view based off the same information set with a lot of this type of information. So I think just a little reminder for us to be careful as we see these types of articles swirling around right now, and especially with some of the important conversations that we have going on in the country in terms of police forces that are seeking additional funding, other police forces that are being threatened with defunding and things of that nature. Just remember to dig a little deeper and always check that stuff out for yourself, and just make sure that that simple summary that maybe is coming at you from a name or brand you trust, myself included, is checked for yourself. I think that's the best thing that I can suggest at the end of all this. What do you think? Let's talk about that in the comments down below. I'll be back on Friday with a brand new episode of Brain Scratch for you right here on the Lord and Arts channel.